welcome. This is the lecture that I'm going to be recording for you in lieu of class tomorrow, which is March 7th. As I told you guys, I will be at jury duty during that time, so unfortunately I won't be able to be in class with you all, but we'll come back together on Thursday and pick up where we left off. The basic assignment is to, number one, view this lecture, and I'll try to keep this to 30 minutes or under, so it won't be too oppressive. And then I will create on Sakai, per an announcement that I'll send you out later today, a discussion forum and a question forum. And in the discussion forum, I'll invite you to raise any discussion you like about the issues and arguments that I'll talk about in this half hour. And then the question forum will be there for you to ask any questions you like. If there's something that I'm saying that's confusing or unclear, you could of course wait until Thursday to ask me, but it's also great when it's top of mind to ask the question. And I'll be live on the discussion forum over the next couple of days to respond, either to get into the discussions on the discussion forum or to answer the questions on the question forum. But more about that to come. So what we're doing today is moving on from the metaphysical content that we've been covering for the first month plus of the course, where we've looked at essentially the question of what are we, and we've looked at the mind-body problem and the personal identity problem, both of which are trying to answer that question of what kind of things we are. And at this point, you're probably sick of hearing about the dualist theory, the identity theory, and the functionalist theory, in addition to the various views on personal identity. Now we shift gears, and at least for the next maybe 3 weeks or so, we're going to look at questions of epistemology, essentially questions of what knowledge is and how much we actually know about the world. And today what I'll do is introduce that subject, give you a sense of a core problem, which is known as the problem of the criterion, and then dive into what will be our main text for this week, Descartes' first meditation from his Meditations on First Philosophy. We encountered Descartes already when we were looking at the mind-body problem, where we looked at the sixth meditation, the sixth chapter of this book that he writes. And we're coming back to him again, number one, because he's the main figure when it comes to epistemology and modern philosophy. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But also number two, he's a very clear writer, so he's a good source for an introductory course, which is why we're looking at him. Anyway, that's it for setting things up, so I'd like to dive in. And first off, I want to introduce you to the concept of epistemology. When we're talking about epistemology, we're talking about the theory of knowledge. You guys are going to get a sense of my typing skills at the moment, I think, as I mistype things and have to retype them. It's called theory of knowledge because the Greek word for knowledge is episteme. There should be an accent on that second E. And episteme just means absolutely certain belief, certain knowledge. It's a really high grade of knowledge. Not the kind of knowledge that you might have where you're pretty sure or you have a sense, but you're dead certain. And so epistemology is going to be the study of, are there any things that we know for certain in this world? And what are they? And how do we distinguish knowledge from mere opinion? And when we think about knowledge versus opinion, this is, I suppose, a theoretical, philosophical question, surely, but it's also a really practical one. And just like the personal identity question was a practical one in the sense that, hey, we bring people to court all the time and we say that they are responsible for something that happened in the past. And that only makes sense to do if that person before you is the same person as in the past. So getting a clear sense of what personal identity consists in is essential for being able to do many of the things that our society does. It's similarly the case with knowledge versus opinion. Even right now, we've got the presidential debates going on in the primary season, and you have people arguing over best public policy, over climate change and whether that counts as knowledge or not. And these sorts of questions rest upon a core assumption of what makes something to be knowledge and what makes something to be opinion. Even debates that sort of cross the line over into a question of faith versus knowledge. Right? So some people will be arguing for certain public policy based on their religious beliefs. And other people might contend with that and say, hey, wait a minute, you can't bring those into public debate because that doesn't count as science or knowledge. So getting a clear sense of the difference between what really makes something to be knowledge and what makes it merely opinion and not knowledge is absolutely critical to doing what we do in the public sphere. It's also important too, let's say at some point you may become parents and you have children in the school system, and you might be quite happy if teachers are teaching your children astronomy, but you're not going to be very happy if they're teaching them astrology. And you're going to have a really clear idea in your mind, perhaps, of the difference between astronomy, which you might consider knowledge, and astrology, which you don't. Or you might quite like them to be teaching your kids American history, but you probably wouldn't want them to be teaching propaganda, right, or certain radical views of American history that ultimately are politically motivated. And so we draw these lines in very practical senses between what knowledge is and what opinion is. So the only way we can do that in a principled way is to start to get clear on what knowledge is. And that's what we'll be doing over the next few weeks. As we're introducing epistemology, we'll be investigating this question of what is knowledge, and then investigating the question of how much of it do we have? And both of those are really important. So that brings us then, that's the introduction to epistemology. I want to turn to look at the problem of the criterion. I'll erase that to clean up the space. Okay, the problem of the criterion. Let's just start with the word criterion, just to get a sense of what that means. And maybe it's helpful to distinguish a criterion from a condition. These are two words that we sometimes use. By the way, the plural of criterion is criteria, so maybe you're more familiar with that word. What is the difference between a criterion and a condition? There's a critical distinction to get before we dive in here. A criterion, or criteria, is simply a way of knowing something. So a criterion for P, whatever P is a way of knowing P. So, for instance, let's say there's a question. Let's say in my kitchen right now there's a cookie jar, and I might be wondering to myself, I wonder if my wife made any cookies this week, and I wonder if there are any cookies in that cookie jar. Maybe my son has eaten them all and there's none left. And so I'm asking myself, are there any cookies in the cookie jar? Now, I could ask you, what are the criteria? That is, what are the ways of knowing if there are any cookies in the cookie jar? And there are lots of things that I could do. I could smell around the cookie jar. It'd be a weird way to do it, but I could stand near the cookie jar and try to smell for the cookies. If I smell any chocolate or sugar, I think, oh yeah, there's cookies in there. I could listen to the cookie jar. I could pick it up and shake it and listen to any sound inside. And if there's sound, if it sounds like cookies banging against the side, that will be a way of knowing that there's cookies in the cookie jar. I could take the simple route and just look inside and see if there are any cookies in the cookie jar. Notice what I'm doing here is going down the list of our senses, because our senses provide criteria for knowing things, right? We use our senses as ways of knowing things. So when we're talking about the problem of the criterion, we're talking about a philosophical question that'll have to do with these things called criteria, and they are ways of knowing things. I do want to distinguish criteria from conditions. And this is something we're going to come back to. It's a fancy distinction that you probably wouldn't have thought of outside of philosophy class, but it's one that we're going to keep coming back to. So I'll give you the first pass of it now. If it's not super clear now, that's totally fine. As long as you get the idea of a criterion, you'll be good for now. And we'll come back to this over time. But what is a condition for something? Let's come back to the cookie jar example. In the case of the cookie jar, I said the criteria for there being a cookie in the cookie jar could be the smell, the sound, the look, or various other tools that I would use to find out if there's a cookie in the cookie jar. The condition of a cookie being in the cookie jar, all we mean by condition here is what has to be true in order for there to be a cookie in the cookie jar. What conditions or things need to be the case for there to be a cookie in the cookie jar. And here we might write out some kind of fancy definition of what a cookie is, and for there to be a cookie in the cookie jar, there must be, and here we just would put a definition of a cookie, a roundish baked good, there's my typing skills, composed of sugar, some salt, vanilla maybe, whatever the essential elements are of a cookie. And if you fulfill those conditions, then you've got a cookie in the cookie jar. Now you might remember, and I don't remember if I used this example in both classes, but I think I did. I made this distinction before in another way when we were talking about necessary and sufficient conditions in an earlier lecture about a week or so ago, when I was talking about being a graduate of Providence College. Here again, we have a distinction between criteria and condition. The criteria for being a graduate of Providence College are the ways that you know if you're a graduate of Providence College. So how do you know if someone is a graduate of Providence College? Maybe they have a diploma. Someone might say, well, there are certain skills that a person has when they're a graduate of Providence College. Okay, maybe they have the mortar board and the gown. You guys probably have to pay a lot of money for those gowns if you don't rent them. So those are all things that might tell someone that you are a graduate. Notice that those things are not conditions for being a graduate. That is, what makes it the case that you're a graduate. Because in that case, to be a graduate, it's not that you have a diploma, because that could, God forbid, burn up in a fire and you no longer have your diploma, or you could lose it. You could lose the skills, you could lose the mortarboard and gown. You would still be a graduate. What is it to be a graduate? It's to pass a certain number of credits in certain areas, blah, 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 blah. That is, take Civ, take philosophy, blah, 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 all that stuff. And if you do all that, then you're a graduate. So here we get, again, another example of the difference between condition and criterion. So, okay, all of that's really not fun at all. But what's the point? Why are we worried about it? Well, the problem of the criterion is a critical core issue in epistemology that we're going to keep coming back to. It's not going to go away throughout this entire discussion of epistemology. So it's important to get clear on it. What is the problem of the criterion? Well, it's pretty simple. The problem of the criterion is simply this. Whenever you're trying to understand these questions of knowledge, and, what knowledge is and how much we have and all those kind of questions, the discussion really devolves into two questions. Number one, what do we know? And number two, what are the conditions of knowing? These two questions are the fundamental questions that the problem of the criterion asks. How do we get there? Well, the basic story is when you're doing epistemology and you're wondering about knowledge, these are the two things you would naturally be interested in. First, what do we know? In other words, what is the extent of our knowledge? If I were to list out all of the fields that count as knowledge, and I put the ones that are knowledge in one bucket and put the ones that aren't in another bucket, which ones go in the knowledge bucket? So astronomy, yes. Astrology, no. History, yes. Propaganda, no. And so on and so on. So what things count as knowledge? And you can imagine a great big book of all the things that count as knowledge. Wikipedia, maybe, is an approximation of that. All the things that count as human knowledge. The second question says, okay, well, it's good to know all the things that we do know. It's good to get that list out there. That's helpful. But notice, I need a principle behind that list. I need to know what the rules are in order to understand when something should go on the list of knowledge or when it shouldn't. In other words, if someone were to present to you a book and they say, here's all of human knowledge, you'd be justified in asking, well, how do you know that those things count as knowledge and not, versus not, right? How do you know that those things that are in the book are really knowledge and that the things that you left out are not knowledge? In other words, what are the conditions for knowing? So we're not asking, what is the extent of knowledge? We're asking what makes knowledge to be knowledge. Okay, so far, pretty straightforward, I'm hoping. These are two questions that we ask. No problem, great. Two questions we would ask about knowledge. How much do we have? Sure. And what makes knowledge to be knowledge? That's useful too. Great, so what's the big deal? Why is this supposedly a problem? Well, here's the funny thing. Suppose I were to say to you, hey, can you tell me how many Zerberts are in this room? Suppose we were in our classroom and I said to you, how many Zerberts are in this room? Please tell me, I need to know immediately. You have 10 seconds to tell me. You might pretty obviously ask me a quick follow-up question. You say, well, hold on, dude, I would love to answer your question, but I have no idea what you're talking about. What is a Zerbert? If you can tell me what this thing is, then I can tell you how many there are. In other words, you would need to already know what the Zerbert is in order to discover the extent of the Zerberts in the room. In other words, if you come back to our problem of the criteria, you need to, for some reason I won't do that, okay. You need to already know the answer to 2 in order to know the answer to 1. Right? According to the question above, you need to know the answer to 2 first. Once you know what makes knowledge to be knowledge, what are the conditions for something to be knowledge, then and only then can you go about answering how much do we have? And that makes pretty good sense. But somebody could argue quite the opposite direction. They say, well, wait a minute, no, that's not how it works at all. If you notice, what are the things that are knowledge? What things do we know? Question 1, what's the extent of our knowledge? That question points us to a bunch of concrete, particular examples of knowledge. And what are the conditions of knowledge, or of knowing? That second question points us to a really abstract idea of what knowledge is. Well, some people might argue, well, look, we don't get the abstract ideas until after we've seen all the concrete particulars. This is a point of view that's typically called empiricism, right? Empiricists, empirical scientists who value getting knowledge from the senses, will tell us that, well, this is the way you've got to go about getting knowledge. You need first to look around the world, see these particular examples, and then you can abstract from them to know what the abstract rule is. And a good example of this might be in learning word usage. So I think we've used this example before, so I'll come back to it. We have come to use the word chair. And when you're teaching a little kid to use words, right, they make a lot of mistakes at first, right? So you show them the chair at the dining room table, and you say chair, and they learn to repeat you, and they go, oh, chair. And you're like, good, you've learned the word chair, excellent. But they don't yet have a full concept, because then there's a stool in the kitchen, and it doesn't look like the chair in the dining room because it has 3 legs instead of 4, and it doesn't have a back. And so you tell your son or daughter, hey, get in the chair. And they look at you, they're like, chair? That's not a chair. There's no back. There's only 3 legs. And you go, no, chair counts here too. This is also a kind of chair. Oh, okay. So now they learn to expand their abstract concept of the word chair to apply to stools. And then you could point to the lazy boy in the living room, and you could point to the bench outside. All these things look very different from that dining room chair. And technically speaking, you could call them all chairs. And so it's only over time, by seeing a bunch of concrete particulars, that you build up the abstract concept of chair, and then you can use it. So when it comes to the problem of the criterion, we could say something similar actually should go on here too. That is, unlike the first thing we said, which is that you need to answer the question in number 2 first, and then you can answer the question in number 1. Somebody else might say, well, no, you need to have an answer to 1 first. You need to already know that these 5 things are chairs before you can abstract from that to come to know the answer to 2, this abstract question of what makes a chair a chair. So notice this problem of the criterion really affects all of our claims about knowledge, and it's pretty tough, right? On the one hand, it looks like you could make a case for saying you need to know the conditions of a thing before you know the extent. I need to know what a Zerbert is before I can tell you how many there are. On the other hand, you could say, well, wait a minute. I'm not going to know what Zerberthood is, what a Zerbert is in the abstract, until you show me a few of them. So I need to know already how many Zerberts there are. These 5 things are Zerberts, say. And then I can look at those 5 and then abstract the conditions, just like a little kid does when they're learning language. And they see 5 different chairs, and now they can use the word chair skillfully. So this is the problem of the criterion. There seems to be this inherent circularity in our question about knowledge. When we're curious about epistemology, there's 2 things we want to know. Which things count as knowledge, the extent of knowledge, and what makes knowledge knowledge anyway. So we need both of those. Okay, great. But in order to have both of those, it looks like knowing either one already requires knowing the other one. And so you end up in this circularity. So this is the problem with the criterion. This is something we're going to keep coming back to. For now, I'm just introducing it to you. What we're going to do is to take one particular approach to this problem now, and then we'll come back and look at the other approach. So this first approach here that I've described in terms of saying, well, you need to answer 2 first before you answer 1. You need to know what knowledge is in order to know the extent of it. This is sometimes called Methodism. Do not confuse that with the religious view of Methodism. It's different. The idea of Methodism here is the idea that, well, you need to already know the method of what knowledge is, the abstract rule or principle or method, before you can determine how much knowledge you have. And the other theory is sometimes called particularism, and that idea, pretty straightforwardly, says, well, you need to know the concrete particulars before you know the abstract method. We're going to start here with Methodism as we look at René Descartes and his case for skepticism. And we're starting there mostly just because that's where Descartes starts, and he's the big source here, so we'll go with that as we start. But by the end of this, I'll invite you to reflect on which of those two seem more plausible to you as a route, because it doesn't look like we can have both. It looks like we've got to pick one of these two routes here, and it's not obvious which one we should pick. Alrighty. So that takes us from the introduction of epistemology through just an introduction to the problem of the criterion. We'll come back to that if it's not perfectly clear. But let's dive into this last piece, Descartes' first meditation and the case for skepticism, as this will launch us into all of the really big questions of epistemology. So let's just start with a little background. I don't normally do this, but it's kind of helpful for understanding what's going on in Descartes' first meditation. So René Descartes is, he lives from 1596 to 1650. He publishes his major work, the Meditations on First Philosophy, in 1641, and that's the book that we've read little bits of, where he's got 6 chapters that he calls Meditations. Descartes is really important for us in doing epistemology because he actually fundamentally changes the game in philosophy, for good or ill. There are people who have different opinions on this, but definitely the world of philosophy has not been anywhere near what it was like after 1641, because the basic difference that he introduced was this. Before Descartes, people started doing philosophy with metaphysics. That is to say, they started thinking about philosophical questions by beginning with questions of, what is real in the world? What am I? Is there a God? Those sort of big questions about the world. Right? And then later, as they started to answer or failed to answer those questions, they turned to reflect on epistemology. That is, the question of what is the extent of knowledge? What are the conditions of knowledge? And that was always the order, right? So you go to Plato, to Aristotle, to Augustine, to Aquinas, all the way up to Descartes. Everybody always started with metaphysics and turned to epistemology. As we'll see in a moment, Descartes opens his book, The Meditations on First Philosophy, with epistemological questions. Essentially what he does is open the book with a case for the view called skepticism. And skepticism is just the idea that we cannot know anything. Now, we'll examine that in some detail and ask whether that's a coherent position. But he makes really persuasive arguments for thinking that, in fact, we don't know most of the things we think we do, and quite possibly we don't know anything at all. And the arguments he gives for skepticism are so good that philosophy ever since has been trying to dig its way out. So much of what philosophers that you might have heard of in Civ say, after Descartes, people like John Locke, David Hume, George Berkeley, all British philosophers, philosophers on the continent of Europe like Leibniz or Spinoza or Immanuel Kant or Hegel or various other philosophers, all of them are so influenced by Descartes because they realize how persuasive his arguments are that they restructure how they do philosophy so that they start with epistemology and then go to metaphysics. And essentially what they end up doing because of that is changing what they believe about what's real, what they are, whether there's a God, and various other questions of metaphysics as a result of the limits that they find in epistemology. This is highly controversial. Lots of philosophers will disagree about this. We won't say too much about it. But just note that what we're about to look at in Descartes' philosophy, and I'll walk you through the text in a moment, is extraordinarily influential and, as we'll see in a little bit, really hard to argue with. So what I'd like to do is to pull up some of Descartes' text, which I've plugged in here to my Word document. There we go. And I want to walk you through some of the text. It might be a little small, so I'm going to highlight this and make it a bit larger. If I can view my, let's see. Get my ribbon up here. Okay, I'm going to make this text a little larger. I'm hoping you can see this pretty well. So these are the opening lines of Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. This is the first meditation, his first chapter. And I really want to walk you through the text here so we can examine it together. And then this will lead us to what will essentially wrap our lecture today by reflecting on his major arguments for skepticism. So here's the text. Some years ago, I was struck by the large number of falsehoods that I had accepted as true in my childhood, and by the highly doubtful nature of the whole edifice that I had subsequently based on them. I realized that it was necessary, once in the course of my life, to demolish everything completely and start again right from the foundations if I wanted to establish anything at all in the sciences that was stable and likely to last. Let me just stop there for a moment. I want you to notice a couple of things here. First, Descartes' interest is in demolishing all of his opinions, kind of destroying everything that he's always believed, tearing it all down. And you might wonder, why in the world would you do that? And Descartes comes under a lot of criticism for this. Right? You may come across other philosophy professors on this campus who will hate Descartes because he tore down so much of the philosophical structures of the ancient world and the medieval world. And in so doing, he essentially created the modern world that we all live in. And you might wonder, well, why would he do that? And here he tells us, right? His intention is not to demolish the past because he wants to demolish the past, but rather Descartes is operating at a time where he's a scientist, and science is very messy in 1641, right? So there's no clear scientific methodology. When you're doing science, it's kind of a hodgepodge of the burgeoning scientific method of coming up with a hypothesis, testing it with data, going back to the hypothesis and attempting to just disconfirm it, and all the things you might have learned in 6th grade when you learned about the scientific method. But also a traditional philosophical method where people will quote St. Augustine or quote Aquinas and then do a philosophical argument using the methods that we've used in our class. And also the methods of theology, where people would point back to a sacred text or point back to the writings of a church father and then consider that to be authoritative. And all of those methods mixed together makes for a really messy science. So Descartes wants to eliminate everything, kind of clean, like as if you were cleaning the house and you took everything out of the house first, cleaned it really well and really deeply, and then put everything back. That's exactly his intention here. So in a few moments, you're going to see that he's going to come up with some really radical arguments for thinking we don't know anything at all. And that's not because he really thinks we don't know anything at all. It's rather because, just like the person doing a deep cleaning in the house, he wants to get everything out and only let back in that which is good. Second thing I want you to notice is the metaphors that he's using here. Oops, there we go. So he talks about the doubtful nature of the whole edifice, that he wants to demolish everything and start again from the foundations, and he wants to establish something that's stable and likely to last. Notice that he's using building metaphors here, and it's worth noting, I'll make a little space here, it's worth noting that Descartes is assuming a view called foundationalism in doing his philosophy. And it's worth saying just a word about this. Foundationalism is a core epistemological concept, which just says that our knowledge is structured like a building. And just like with a building, you've got foundations and then a superstructure, so too in our knowledge. You've got foundations, certain basic beliefs that we have, and then a superstructure built on top of that. Why is this relevant? Well, if Descartes is going to demolish everything, and he's going to try to clear out everything, all of his beliefs, and eliminate them all, in order to only bring back in the ones that are certain and stable, and that will help create a science that is likely to last, then if he assumes the idea of foundationalism, he doesn't need to attack every single belief one by one. Rather, if he can find a way to go at the foundations and knock them out, then the whole superstructure should fall on its own. And so, that's what we're going to see him do here. He's going to make some arguments that are going to go after the core foundations of our beliefs, and then, so he thinks, all the rest of our beliefs will collapse. Again, his goal is not at all to collapse the beliefs. That's a means to an end. That's not the end itself. He's looking to collapse all of the beliefs and then clean them up, right? To use the building metaphor, to find the bricks and the boards that are still sturdy and useful, and rebuild the structure with those. And the basic foundations that he's talking about here are the senses and reason. These are the two main sources of knowledge that he's going to go after. So let's read on a little bit more, and then we'll see what his argument is, and then we'll wrap our lecture for today. He goes on to say, but the task looked an enormous one. Descartes is sort of notorious for being rather lazy. But the task looked an enormous one, and I began to wait until I should reach a mature enough age to ensure that no subsequent time of life would be more suitable for tackling such inquiries. This led me to put off the project for so long that I would now be to blame if by pondering over it any further, I wasted the time still left for carrying it out. So today I have expressly rid my mind of all worries and arranged for myself a clear stretch of free time. I am here quite alone, and at last will devote myself sincerely and without reservation to the general demolition of my opinions. So notice then that his intention, as we said, in this meditation will be to demolish all of his opinions. So again, as you see him making these arguments, try to reserve the judgment, like, hey, what's wrong with this guy? Why is he trying to attack all of his opinions? Remember, there's a method to his madness, and he's going to be doubting things using what we call methodological doubt. Right? And when I say methodological doubt, what I mean is Descartes is not truly dubious of his reasoning powers or his senses. He doesn't really believe in skepticism. Rather, he's going to be treating his beliefs with a high degree of skepticism simply because that's he thinks a good means to the end of being able to find the beliefs that can withstand criticism. So just like if you were, this is one of Descartes' examples, if you were cooking for some very esteemed guests and you were picking out the produce for the dinner, you might look at some of the fruit or some of the vegetables and you think, okay, well, these could be good, but any of those vegetables that have any chance of being bad, if there's any marring on the skin, anything that looks like it might be a bruise, I'm not even going to take a chance on it. I'm just going to throw it away and just keep the things that look absolutely perfect because I want the dinner to be perfect. So too, he's going to do the same thing with his beliefs. Any belief that doesn't look perfect, he's going to throw it out. So he goes on to articulate that, and then this will lead us to his argument. So I'll just read through the rest of this. But to accomplish this, that is this task of clearing out all of his beliefs, it will not be necessary for me to show that all my opinions are false, which is something I could perhaps never manage. Reason now leads me to think that I should hold back my assent from opinions which are not completely certain and indubitable, just as carefully as I do from those which are patently false. So notice that principle, that I should hold back my assent from opinions which are not completely certain and indubitable, just as carefully as I do from those which are patently false, is this principle of methodological doubt. Right? This is exactly what Descartes is saying. Right? That's the rule of methodological doubt. That he's going to be so skeptical that anything that has the slightest reason for doubt, he's chucking it. So, for the purpose of rejecting all of my opinions, It will be enough if I find in each of them at least some reason for doubt, and to do this I will not need to run through them all individually, which would be an endless task. Once the foundations of a building are undermined, anything built on them collapses of its own accord. So I will go straight for the basic principles on which all my former beliefs rested. So again, notice this is the implication of foundationalism. He doesn't need to go through every single belief. He can just go for the basic principles. Now, what I want to suggest to you is here, at this part of the text, he's going to give us one argument, and it's going to be against the senses. And then in the second paragraph, he's going to give us a second argument against the senses. And that's going to, we're going to look at those two kinds of reasoning, and that will wrap up our lecture for today. He will go on to make an argument against reason, and that's something we'll pick up on Thursday. So here's what Descartes says. Whatever I have up till now accepted as most true, I have acquired either from the senses or through the senses. But from time to time I have found that the senses deceive, and it is prudent never to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. So let me pause there. This is an argument we're not going to examine in detail. We're going to look at the second argument in detail. But notice what he's basically arguing. Essentially he's saying, well, the senses have deceived us from time to time. It's prudent never to trust completely senses that have deceived us even once. Therefore, we shouldn't trust the senses. Or in other words, the senses cannot give us knowledge. So he's basing this conclusion that I shouldn't trust the senses on these two principles. That from time to time the senses deceive, and if something ever deceives you even once, it could do it again, so you should never trust it. There's questions you could raise here as to whether the senses actually ever do deceive us, right? So, Descartes is thinking of things like optical illusions, right? You get an oar while you're rowing a boat, and you stick the oar in water, and it looks like it's bent when you look at it through the water. That's an optical illusion. These optical illusions, you could say, are not really the fault of the senses. It's the fault of reason for misjudging them. And if we think about the fact that an oar in water will look bent, we'll know that it's not really bent. So there's some room to get out of that argument. Again, we're not going to study that argument for our purposes in this course, so I'm just noting it for you. The more powerful argument, the one that's more interesting, comes in this next paragraph. And this is the one we'll pause on for a few minutes, and then I'll wrap up our lecture for today. He goes on to say, yet although the senses occasionally deceive us with respect to objects which are very small or in the distance, there are many other beliefs about which doubt is quite impossible, even though they are derived from the senses. For example, that I am here sitting by the fire, wearing a winter dressing gown, holding this piece of paper in my hands, and so on. Again, how could it be denied that these hands or this whole body are mine, unless perhaps I were to liken myself to madmen whose brains are so damaged by the persistent vapors of melancholia that they firmly maintain that they are kings when they are really paupers, or say they are dressed in purple when they are naked, or that their heads are made of earthenware, it's an interesting insult, or that they are pumpkins or made of glass. But such people are insane, and I would be thought equally mad if I took anything from them as a model for myself. Now here comes the argument. A brilliant piece of reasoning. As if I were not a man who sleeps at night, and regularly has all the same experiences while asleep, as madmen do while awake. Indeed, sometimes even more improbable ones. How often asleep at night am I convinced of just such familiar events, that I am here in my dressing gown sitting by the fire when in fact I am lying undressed in bed. TMI. He goes on to sort of elaborate that a bit more here in this paragraph. But hopefully you can see the basic idea that he's conveying, and I'm going to make a little room here. Essentially what Descartes is saying is the following. First, he's suggesting to us, and here's the argument summary coming, he's suggesting to us that dreams have a really particular power. They're able to replicate what goes on in our day-to-day waking life. And we can be tricked, right? There are times when you're in a dream and you think it's real, right? So have you ever had the dream where you're late for an exam and then you wake up, oh my gosh, oh, that didn't happen, it's still early. Or you have a dream that you fail an exam or something like that. It's very common. And Descartes seems to suggest, well, if I'm to know for sure what I'm seeing in front of me is real, I need to be able to rule out the fact that I'm dreaming right now. Because if I were dreaming, then I would be just like these madmen. To think my head is made of earthenware or something when it's really not. So this allows us to construct a really powerful argument. And it's simply known as the dreaming argument from Meditation 1. And the argument basically goes like this. It's really simple. First, in order to know anything through the senses, again, this is an argument attacking the senses only, not attacking reason. In order to know anything through the senses, I must know that I am not dreaming. Let me just start there. In order to know anything through the senses, I must know that I'm not dreaming. The basic idea here is, in order to know right now, for instance, that I'm sitting here in my office, that I'm looking at my computer screen, that I'm speaking about Descartes, instead of, for instance, that I was just having a dream about these things, I need to be able to exclude the fact that I'm dreaming. I need to rule out the fact that I'm dreaming. If I can't rule out the fact that I'm dreaming right now, how do I know for sure I'm doing these things? Right? So let's say you're on a lovely vacation in Hawaii and you're surfing. And this is so beautiful. It's unreal, you say. You might actually pause in a philosophical moment and say, hey, wait a minute. Am I really here? Or could I be dreaming this? And what Descartes is saying is, in order to know for sure that you're really on the island of Kauai and that you're getting these great waves and enjoying this wonderful vacation, you actually do need to rule out the fact that you're dreaming. You need to be able to prove that you're not dreaming. You need to be able to prove that you are awake, in other words, in order to know anything through the senses. And if you can't do that, then you don't know these things that you think you know about the external world. But, he says, I cannot know that I am not dreaming. In other words, dreams are, at least in potential, perfect replicants of reality. They're perfect replicants of reality. They're things that can perfectly copy what the waking world is around us. And so, because of that, at any moment where let's say I am actually awake, I can't be sure that this waking state that I'm in isn't actually a dream state. This waking state that I think I'm in anyway isn't actually a dream state. Because think of it, what test could you provide to prove that you're awake right now, to prove that you're not dreaming? Well, pinch yourself. Okay, but you could be dreaming that you were pinching yourself. Okay, well, I can look around with clarity and distinctness. I can count to 10. I can remember all sorts of things about the last 20 minutes, etc., etc. Okay, great. But couldn't you have a dream where all of those things happen too? And the problem is, because dreams could perfectly replicate reality, it looks like there's no test you could ever do that could prove that you're not dreaming. So, it looks like I cannot know anything through the senses. So this is Descartes' famous dreaming argument from the first meditation. Okay. Notice a couple things before we wrap up, and this is the argument that I'll invite you to reflect on in the discussion forum. First off, premise 1 gives us this abstract principle, right? That in order to know anything through the senses, you must know that you're not dreaming, right? Again, pay attention that you have to know that you're not dreaming. Not that you can come to know that you are dreaming. You have to know that you're not. In other words, you need to know that you're awake. So in order to know anything through the senses, I need to know that I'm awake. Okay, that first premise is something we're going to examine more on Thursday. It's sometimes called a principle of exclusion. And the principle of exclusion is a philosophical principle, an epistemological principle specifically, that says, in order to know that P is true, I need to exclude any possibilities inconsistent with P being true. In order to know that something's true, I need to exclude any possibilities inconsistent with that. I'll just give you a brief example of that. Suppose I were looking out my kitchen window right now, and I see a yellow bird. And I say, ooh, look, it's a canary in the backyard. And my son's coming by and say, Marco, look, it's a canary in the backyard. Ooh, look at that. Okay, that sounds great. But, I don't know anything about birds. I know canaries are little yellow birds, and I see a little yellow bird. And I asked myself the philosophical question, well, do I know that that's a canary? Now, suppose that there are other little yellow birds that from this distance look exactly like canaries. They're indistinguishable. Call them goldfinches. These actually exist. They are little yellow birds that look just like canaries from 20 yards. And let's just say nobody, even someone who knows birds well, could distinguish a canary from a goldfinch from 20 yards away. You need to get up close to notice the markings. So when I say, oh, look, a canary, and we ask, well, wait, do you actually know it's a canary? Well, no, you don't. If you agree that, no, I don't know it's a canary because I can't say that for sure that it's not a goldfinch, then you agree with this principle of exclusion. You do think that in order to know something, you need to exclude the possibilities inconsistent with it. Here in this argument, dreaming is one of those possibilities. Premise 2, note, is not an abstract principle at all. It's a very concrete thing. It's saying, hey, in this particular case, I cannot know that I'm not dreaming. There's no way I can rule out that I'm dreaming right now. Notice here, this premise is asserting, essentially, that dreams have the ability to perfectly replicate waking states. So if you really want to reject number 2, you're going to need to find some criterion for wakefulness, some way to know for sure that you're not dreaming, some way to know for sure that you are actually awake. And examples like pinching yourself, etc., they're not very good because you can obviously have a dream of those things. So we're going to need to find something else if you want to reject premise 2. So you've really got 2 options as you think about this argument. If you want to get out of it, you can reject premise 1 or you can reject premise 2. I mean, obviously, of course, there's the question of, is the argument valid? And it certainly seems to be valid. If you put 1 and 2 together, it looks like 3 falls out right away. So I want to suggest to you that it is. You can disagree with that, of course. We can talk more about it in class. But it looks like it's valid. So you've got 2 options. And I'll leave this to you as you turn to the discussion forum. You could deny premise 1. In other words, you could say, well, look, I disagree with this principle of exclusion. I don't think you need to exclude the possibilities inconsistent with something in order to know it. In that case, you're going to have to say that I do know that it's a canary out there, even though I can't rule out the goldfinch. Okay. It's a tough one to argue with, but you could do it. The other one you could do is to deny number 2 and to say, no, I think there's a way that I can know for sure that I'm awake, and here's my criterion for wakefulness. Again, it's going to have to do better than something like pinching yourself. One last thing before I go. This whole argument is based on the idea of dreaming, which is a real psychological state that we enter. Do notice that we can modify this argument in all sorts of ways, if you like. And since we've already talked about artificial intelligence before, I'll bring that into play. There is this hypothesis that at a certain point in time in the future, we will have no trouble extracting a brain from a human body that's still alive and putting it into a vat of nutrients and liquids that'll keep it alive and stimulated, so as to, just like in that old movie The Matrix, sort of stimulate this brain to experience a virtual reality world. This is sometimes called the brain in a vat hypothesis. In other words, rather than worrying about, maybe I could be dreaming right now, you could ask yourself, well, right now I believe that I am a freshman or sophomore at Providence College in 2016. Okay, that's what you believe. But how do you know that this isn't actually the year 2500 and that we have developed this brain vat technology and you are a brain extracted from the body of a 65-year-old male or female or something? And they tried an experiment up at MIT where they put the brain into a vat of nutrients and they decided, hey, let's program this brain to believe it's 2016 and they are a freshman or sophomore at Providence College and will do all the normal experiences that we'd expect that person to have. In that case, is there any way to know from inside the matrix, so to speak, from inside your own mind, to know whether you're actually in a vat and not in reality? Is there any way to know that you're definitely in reality? That's really the question that we're wrestling with here. It seems very abstract, but as we'll see when we wrap this up, there's actually a lot of practical implications to this. So for the discussion forum, and I'll mercifully let you guys go now, for the discussion forum, this is the argument that I want you to think about. I'll send you an announcement on Sakai that'll remind you of that. And take a shot at it. What do you think might be some ways that you could get out of this argument? How can we attack Descartes and defend our knowledge? All right. That is it for me. Thank you guys very much for being patient and for listening. I lost track of time, but I don't think we've gone much over a half hour if we have. So that's it for me. We will come back on Thursday. I'll recap some of the stuff and check in with you to see what you may not have understood clearly or that I was unclear in expressing. And we'll clarify those things, and then we'll take a step forward and wrestle with some other skeptical arguments and see where we come out on the other end. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate your being flexible with my jury duty requirements. I don't have a choice, otherwise they will arrest me, I think, or something like that, so it's not really my option. But I look forward to seeing you guys again on Thursday. Take care.